Our given topic of managing intraday liquidity risk in banking requires in-depth analysis of both SIMIO and Excel data. In this project, we are required to find profit-maximizing quantities of USD, GBP, and EUR that SafeBank should have on hand that is subject to acceptable risk. These quantities will be found across 3 different scenarios: business as usual, a market trend towards one type of currency and away from another, and the loss of a counterparty. Given the problem, there are multiple variables to consider. SafeBank has the ability to exchange currency between USD, GBP, and EUR. CLS resets the quantities of each type of currency at the end of each workday, which goes from 8 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. SafeBank can ask Globobank to replenish quantities of a currency if it runs out before the day is over. Risk is solely measured by the day for SafeBank, hence intraday risk. SafeBank charges clients a 0.02% fee per currency exchange, and CLS charges SafeBank a 0.01% fee per currency reset. For our simulation model, we needed to take into consideration what needed to be represented. This is data that could be found in Excel. After implementing a few data analysis techniques in Excel, we were able to find variables that we needed in our simulation, such as exchange rates per currency, and our arrival rates per currency, and initial quantities of each type of currency. After implementing the necessary variables, we needed to further analyze our simulation model to find the amount of each currency needed at the beginning of each trading day, the swap policy including the trigger point and swap amount for each currency type. We also needed to track certain outcomes, such as minimum inventory levels for each currency, revenue from transactions, costs from settlements and swaps, opportunity cost, and profit. We are tasked with finding these values across all 3 scenarios.
Should Globobank be utilized? In order to allow values to be best represented, we converted the 8% annual opportunity cost to a daily opportunity cost of 0.0219%. Using this data, we developed a linear program pictured below to indicate acceptable values for money borrowed from Globobank and money invested. Even though we determined that Globobank swaps were not worth the cost compared to the opportunity cost of investing, we still needed to develop a policy for swapping. It is stated in the problem statement that the average response time for Globobank is 30 minutes, with a standard deviation of 2 minutes. We can say that 99% of Globobank transactions will take 34 minutes and 39 seconds to complete. In order to find the swap amount, we took a sample of all transaction values for each currency in 34 minutes and 39 seconds.
For the business as usual scenario, our group was provided with data reflecting the business as usual transaction trends and behaviors processed by SafeBank in one day. Analysis of data in Excel allowed us to determine average interarrival times for each currency, currency exchange weights, and currency exchange rates. After reviewing information provided for the SafeBank system, we decided to model the SafeBank system in our SIMIO as 3 separate entities represented by 3 separate currency types, sources, the corresponding workstations for their exchanges, as well as the exits for the currency amount that the original currency was exchanged to. When calculating the interarrival times for the currency types, we decided to determine the average interarrival times pertaining to each currency from the data provided, and then applying those interarrival times to our SIMIO model. We made the assumption that every currency type would have the same interarrival time as the average interarrival time determined in our Excel file. We found the average USD interarrival time to be roughly 0.19 seconds, the British pound to be roughly 0.29 seconds, and the euro to have an interarrival time of roughly 0.16 seconds. We then assigned those interarrival times to the sources pertaining to our 3 different entity currency types: the US dollar transactions coming in source, the GBP transactions coming in source, and the EUR transactions coming in source. In recognizing that our SIMIO model needed to accurately reflect the flow of particular currencies being exchanged to another type of currency, we decided to determine the percentages of exchanges between the three currency types and then model them in our SIMIO using those percentages as our path weights. This allowed our system to reflect a realistic flow of each transaction type based upon the provided data. We found that of the incoming US dollar currencies, 76% of them were exchanged to euros, and about 24% were exchanged to British pound. Out of the incoming euro transactions, we found that about 6% were exchanged to the pound, and 74% were exchanged to the US dollar. And then out of our incoming pound transactions, we found that about 16% were exchanged to euros, and about 84% were exchanged to the US dollar. In our model, again, we applied these percentages to our path weights, allowing our SIMIO to accurately reflect the real-life, business-as-usual transactions within SafeBank. Knowing that SafeBank provided exchange services, we knew that the incoming currency amount values did not equate to the outgoing currency amount values. We knew that it would be important for us to not only calculate but reflect the exchange rates within our SIMIO model. We were able to calculate exchange rates from the provided data by determining the ratios between the incoming amount of one currency to the outgoing amount of another. In order for us to track the on-hand or in-system amount of each currency, we needed to have our SIMIO program track it. We applied these exchange ratios when inputting what numbers to add to and subtract from our system statistics before exiting state assignments. This allowed us to equate what amounts we'd have on hand depending upon what amounts of particular currencies left the system and enter the system. Due to SIMIO system limitations, we were not able to have our entities reflect exact dollar amounts pertaining to transactions. Instead, we decided to have our USD, GBP, and EUR entities reflect one transaction. When calculating the on-hand currency amounts for each of those currencies, we then would multiply the entity quantity pertaining to each of the currencies by the average incoming transaction sizes. Determining the average incoming transaction sizes allowed us to apply this assumption and allowed us to do further analysis of our system and on-hand amounts for each of the currency types.
To find the values on hand, running total of each currency through each transaction was recorded. The most negative value through the day was selected as the amount starting on hand. Since we did not want to utilize GlobalBank, we selected 0 as the trigger amount for the swap, which should never be reached in theory. The swap amount is the amount that flowed through SafeBank in 34 minutes and 39 seconds. Revenue was calculated by taking 0.02% of each transaction incoming amount and converting those entirely to US dollars. Cost was divided between opportunity cost and settling costs. Those values were converted to US dollars also. Profit is simply the difference between the revenue and cost.
In scenario 2, a country in the EU defaults. Financial events alter the probability that the volume of transactions to and from each currency are all equally likely. A default results in the country's loss in value of the currency for both the country itself and its counterparts. So we're assuming that there is an EU default for dealing with SafeBank. SafeBank has the privilege of having a data set of transactions that shows how much impact defaulting has on global currency exchanges. We found that the number of transactions from USD and GBP into EUR changed significantly from the business-as-usual dataset. With this information, we first decided to change the inter-arrival times of transactions into EUR currency. While the average time that transactions arrived did increase, which means that currency exchanges into EUR decreased, neither that nor the amount of those transactions warranted a fundamental change to our model. Once we ran our model, we found that with the new starting amounts, our on-hand currencies never fell to a point where we would have to worry about running out of any currency type. We recommend that SafeBank begins their day with about 3 billion US dollars, 1 billion euros, and 4 billion British pounds. As you can see, the starting amounts for euros is much less than the other two currencies, and this supports the idea that customers want to divest in defaulted currencies.
Our group was asked to simulate a situation where we would not have the option to use Global Bank for midday exchanges when on-hand amounts of each currency type were low. We determined in our business as usual analysis that it would be in SafeBank's best interest to not use Global Bank and instead keep an excess amount of currency on hand. Therefore, our models for Scenario 1 and Scenario 3 are the same, as are our recommendations.
It is stated in the problem statement that under a worst-case scenario, SafeBank holds 30 billion US dollars, 20 billion euros, and 10 billion Great British pounds. These values were generated by multiplying the largest net change in currency caused by a single client by 30. When we do this with our values from Scenario 1, we get 7.86 billion US dollars, 255 billion euros, and 120 billion Great British pounds. These values differ significantly from the values stated in the problem statement. We suggest that considering our model was built off of not using Global Bank, they accept values closer to those we found to minimize the cost of using Global Bank.